This episode is made possible by NetSuite by Oracle and Brex, the AI-powered spend platform.
Hi, it's Will Johnson, CFO of Iterable, and you're listening to the CFO Thought Leader Podcast.
This is episode 968.
When people say there's a 10% chance of that drug getting to the finish line, you think to yourself, well, if I get 10 drugs, one of them will work, right? And I'll be rich. But there's a very important premise underlying all those calculations, and that is that you can finance yourself to the finish line. And so all of modern corporate finance, Miller Modigliani and all this stuff that you learn in business school is all premised on the fact that the capital markets are perfect and allow you at some cost to get to the end. And in the real world, it's not that way. And so, as I say, it sounds trite, but it is very deep. I mean, you've got to stay alive until you figure out what's going to work.
Hi, it's Jack. On today's show, we speak with David Snyder, CFO of Coya Therapeutics. It was the type of introduction that any MBA student would envy, and one at which David Snyder, 35 years later, still marvels. Back in the late 1980s, a business school classmate introduced Snyder to notable investor and billionaire tycoon Sam Zell, who subsequently offered Snyder a job. More than any one deal or acquisition target, Snyder recalls, the greatest lessons from his days with Zell came from the sideline conversations, where Zell enlightened his young team members to the investor's point of view. A point of view, Snyder tells us, he still comes to the table with each and every day. You'll hear that story and much more on today's episode. We'll begin after this. 37,025-1. These are the three numbers to remember to get the visibility and control you need to make the right business decisions instantly. 37,000. That's the number of businesses which have upgraded to NetSuite by Oracle. NetSuite is the #1 cloud financial system, streamlining accounting, financial management, inventory, HR, and more. 25. NetSuite turns 25 this year. That's 25 years of helping businesses do more with less, close their books in days, not weeks, and drive down expenses. 1. Because your business is one of a kind, you should get a customized solution for all of your KPIs in one efficient system and with one source of truth. Manage risk, get reliable forecasts, and improve margins. Everything you need, all in one place. Right now, download NetSuite's popular KPI checklist designed to give you consistently excellent performance, absolutely free, at netsuite.com/KPI. That's netsuite.com/KPI. Hello, we're speaking to David Snyder, CFO of Coya Therapeutics. David, welcome.
Thanks. Great to be here, Jack.
David, as you look back in time, what are some of the experiences you feel prepared you to do what you do today as CFO of a biotech company? What would you tell us?
Well, maybe three. I think the most important one, perhaps, is my first job out of business school. I came to Chicago to work for Sam Zell, a name some people may know. He was a prominent investor, multi-billionaire. And at the time, he'd made most of his money in real estate, and he was trying to do corporate acquisition work and was hiring young guys out of business school like me to do that. And spending time with Sam really, I think, informed me about the investor's point of view.
Can I ask you, and I'm going to interrupt you, I'm sorry. How does one meet Sam? Does that just happen? Was he at a business school event? I don't know.
Well, is it just so happens a good friend of mine from business school, his dad ran one of Sam's portfolio companies. And Sam had this idea that he'd like to hire some MBAs, and then asked, the portfolio CEO, whose son was at business school, and he and I were pals, and he just said, "Hey, I'm going to have this, trying to put a dinner together with Sam Zell. Would you like to come?"
And this is, I should let the listeners know, this is the Harvard Business School. You attended.
It was, yeah. Listen, I grew up in small town Kansas. I didn't know guys like Sam Zell existed. But in any case, that's how I met him. And, he's a lot of what people sort of have heard. He's certainly very charismatic, very dynamic, very opinionated, investor. And quite frankly, at a time when a small venture fund, a good-sized venture fund back in the 80s was $50 or $75 million, Sam and his partner purportedly had $500 million worth of net worth. And so I thought, I was very interested in this intersection of strategy and finance. And I think that's what investors do. And I would say 35 years later, I could say that's what CFOs are doing, right? I think the role we often play in our companies is helping translate those strategic imperatives of the company into, a financial story. In any case, I'm getting ahead of myself.
And I'm going to interrupt you, I'm afraid, because I'm intrigued by who you were way back when. Small town Kansas, you go to Ottawa University, and then within 2 years, you're going to Harvard Business School. Why Ottawa from Kansas?
Well, and some people are confused at this point. I grew up in Ottawa, Kansas, not Ottawa, Canada.
All right, my mistake, yeah.
6 months after I was born, my dad decided, he was an accountant with Arthur Andersen, decided that he wanted to join the faculty of this small college in rural Kansas. And so, off we went. So I grew up in this small farm town outside of Kansas City. A bit of a chip off the old block, I guess. My dad taught, he was an accountant by training. Frankly, by interest, an organizational behaviorist. He did his doctoral work in organizational behavior. In any case, so I grew up there, thought I was going to get a PhD in economics, spent a semester at Penn. And frankly, when I was at Penn, understood that there was a name for this thing that I wanted to do, and it was called investment banking. I didn't know that investment banking existed as a thing, but I had this vague idea that finance and Wall Street in New York would be interesting. And I met friends at Wharton, and I was in the School of Arts and Sciences getting this PhD, but my friends were at Wharton, and they helped me understand that maybe a better path for me would be to not get a PhD in economics, but instead get an MBA. And they marched me over to the admissions office at Penn and said, "You got to let Econ Dave into the January class." And they said, "Well, have you taken the GMAT?" And I said, "Well, no, but I'm in the PhD program. Maybe I could do the work." And they gave me very good advice, for which I will tell you I'm enormously grateful. They said, "We would really prefer that you work before you come to business school." And so I did. I went and worked for, I can tell you that story too, but I worked for 2.5 years in commercial banking consulting, and then, had the good fortune to be admitted to the Harvard Business School, and now we're caught up on the story.
Yeah, but already you've demonstrated that you're quite a networker in the university environment. You're making connections, business relationships. You're pretty good at that, even then. As you get introduced to Sam, it was from a classmate. So clearly, you're sort of this person that people like to connect with and go to. How am I doing? No?
Well, you're not. I'm not going to say no. That's very flattering. For all you knew, I only had one friend. I was just lucky that he was the guy that knew Sam.
Yeah. So forgive me, I interrupted, but I just felt like I needed to figure things out a little more. Why you could make an impression on someone like Sam, I think that's helpful. So thank you. Tell us about what happens exactly with that relationship and where you go from there.
Well, I spent 1 year working, in a small group of guys, reporting directly to Sam, and we were looking at investment opportunities that he, might make. And, and I think that just sort of played on the strategy and finance skills that a young MBA type has. And so, I could do that. But I think, just by proximity and through sort of Socratic, if I may say, dialogue with Sam, you begin to understand, the investor's point of view, and how sort of an investor thinks about, the operating prospects of a given investment. And I think I've carried that with me through the ensuing 30 years. I mean, I think that my job as the CFO really is to bring that investor's perspective to whatever company I'm in. Just the sales guys are sort of looking out for the customer, and the technology guys are looking out for the platform itself, and the HR guys are looking out for the organization and its employees, and I sort of come to the table thinking about the investors. And in that milieu, hopefully we come up with the right answer for all those constituents.
I'm curious how you continue to grow. It looks as if the early part of your career, sort of what you've been sharing with us, from the investor point of view, you're working with investing companies, organizations. You're not going down the corporate finance lane. You're not progressing from controller to FP&A. That was never your lane. Am I right about that, or does it become?
So it was not my lane. I wasn't a CPA, right? I didn't go work in an FP&A organization. And as a consequence, frankly, I got my CFO job in the scheme of things relatively early, albeit at a smaller company, right? So there's a whole other career path where you could spend 25 years at, giant company and end up as the CFO someday of that company. But in those early days, there's no question, my second job after working for Sam directly was a company that he was building called Eagle Industries. And we were growing that business by acquisition. And so a lot of what I did was, again, getting in, making investment decisions. This was before private equity was a thing. But in some respects, that's, at some level of generality, what we were doing. But I certainly did at a young age get the opportunity to travel with very seasoned group executives that we had managing these businesses, and again, begin to inform myself about how they ought to be run. For a period of time, I was the vice president of, they called it financial and strategic planning. We ran all the budgeting and all of the budget versus actual, the reporting that was coming out of those business units. And so I said there was a lot of the CFO's job that I, had direct responsibility for, or certainly familiarity with, but certainly not what I would characterize as the controllership function. Which brings me then to my third. So how did I finally get there? And I had that investor's hat. I think I had this sense at Eagle of, I was able to observe what a $2 billion manufacturing company looks like, right? And how those pieces fold together, how that reporting all works. I had a quick little CFO job of a public company. We can circle back to that, my very first CFO job. But it was actually my second CFO job where I had the opportunity to, instead of being a public company CFO, which is what I had done at first, to be a financial vice president at a manufacturing company. And I really think that this is extraordinarily important because there are people I know mid-career that have spent time as investment bankers or consultants. And they say, God, this is insane work and I never see my family and I'd like to be a CFO. And the fact is they don't know how to do the job because you have to prepare financial statements. You have to get the debits and credits right. You have to make sure the accruals are done. And I really cut my teeth at a company we called LDEC. It was a portfolio company of a company called Crane. And it was a turnaround opportunity at Crane. And so they invited me to come join this company. And they said, no, it's not going to be a public company, but it's going to be super interesting work. And, you're going to make some nice money because we're going to turn this thing around. And all that proved to be true. But I also, instead of managing a small corporate staff of 3 or 4 or 5, had a full, there was 35 or 40 of us. And, we did the first inventory in the history of the company, and some of this blocking and tackling, I learned how to do.
Were you reporting directly to the CFO at that point?
Well, strictly, I reported to the unit president with dotted line reporting to the CFO. So we were a division of a public entity.
From the very early stages of your career, though, you reported to perhaps the C-suite level or senior management level in every endeavor you ever had. Is that overstating it?
Well,
I'm trying to point out that.
No, I mean that is in fact the case, right? I mean,
you're not an individual who would have gone to IBM and begun in the lower rungs and worked their way up. You were very much engaged with senior management from day one, as you shared with Sam. And these next opportunities that you have, you enter at a rather senior level. When I compare it to other finance executive paths, I think of you as someone who loved the engagement at the upper level from a very early start and possibly couldn't see doing it any other way. I don't know.
Well, and some of that's luck and good fortune, right? So I'm super grateful, yep. Right? And just in the interest of absolute honesty, there was a vice president there that we all reported to at Sam's shop, but I'm not exaggerating when I say he was literally 2 doors down, right? I mean, so anyway, I don't. But you're right. Everywhere, I reported to a CEO everywhere there.
Well, access and exposure to, I'm using it broadly, but I think how you had access and exposure from your career's very early years and that you were able to engage with very senior people. And the fact is, not everyone can. And that's not necessarily due to a lack of access. So I think it reveals something about your abilities to engage with others, which, and here's my point, which is something we see when it comes to finance leaders in biotech, where the engagement with investors sometimes has extra layers, where the discussion's not just about finance, but it's about the science as well, and it's much more. Anyway, it's much more multi-layered. It's much more robust, let's say. Is that right, or am I? Do you see things differently, or?
Well, no, it's true. It's true, and it has many charms. I will say, 45 minutes ago, I was describing to my son about this podcast, and he's flipping through Crane's business, and he said, "Well, the CFO of McDonald's made $7.5 million, Dad. So you're falling behind." But as you've observed, that's just a different career path, right? And it has its rewards and its challenges. I've been very happy with mine. If you take a look at, my wife says many jobs, one wife. Very nice. But there's typically been a transaction, right? So, my first CFO job was with this diversified manufacturing company, and 18 months later it was sold in a big public takeover. My first life science company, I was brought there very specifically to either get it public or get it sold. Nimblegen, and 18 months later we sold it to Roche. That same investor group that invited me to go to Nimblegen was the same investor group at Cellular Dynamics. And that's a very cool company. That we were commercializing stem cell technology developed by Jamie Thompson at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Basically, anything you've sort of heard about stem cells started at the University of Wisconsin in Jamie Thompson's lab. They were the first to do embryonic stem cells. Obviously, that was controversial. He was then the first to come up with what we call the induced pluripotent stem cell, where you take somatic tissue, skin. Basically, you take a skin cell and you can back it up into that pluripotent state. And we thought that would be a very cool either tool for discovery or eventually cellular therapeutic. We got that. It just took a long time, and we thought it was going to be a very big opportunity, and so it was worth investing time behind, and very sort of important to where life sciences was going. We did get.
Can you tell us I'm sorry, I'm always interrupting. Life sciences. When did it become obvious to you that I like this? This is where I'm gonna spread my wings, or less cliche. This is where I'd like to stick around a while and investigate these opportunities around this. Was it apparent from like 3 years in, or what
So
would you have told us?
maybe this is a theme that's emerging, a combination of a good friend and luck. I chased an internet software deal like a lot of guys did back when that was a thing, and learned a ton there. And I want to come back. That's the story that I'm going to tell about sort of the strategic moment. But
Yep.
It became clear that wasn't going to be a place to invest in. And they wanted me to move to Seattle. I wanted to stay in Chicago. So I spent a little time trying to think about what that next thing would be. And I got a call from a friend of mine from Zell days. And he said, David, our family has started up this gene chip company up in Madison. We're trying to take it public. I want somebody that I know and trust to be the CFO. Would you consider doing it? And why life sciences, And he had a very good theory about life sciences. He said, listen, we're investing the grandkids' money. And he said, we think life sciences is where the semiconductors were in the late 50s, early 60s. So if you're investing with a 30-year time horizon, you got to be in life sciences. And David, I think this is going to be a marvelous field. And he said, you know what? You're going to love the science. The people are kind of quirky like you. And, I think you would fit. Okay. So I went up and joined that company, and he was absolutely right. I love the science. Literally, I would bring articles home that I said, this was unknown a week ago, right? And as he predicted, I also love the people. I mean, it's a very nice census. And it was very different than software, right? Guys that are skilled coders can, at age 17 or 18, do some very remarkable things, right? But you just can't develop the domain expertise in life sciences without getting a PhD and a postdoc. And so it just was, they were frankly older, more mature people. And interestingly enough, probably half of our census was women. And so it was a little more congenial environment for women to be in. And so, but it still had that same edgy, like we just discovered this last week, And so I did find the field congenial, and now I've helped 5 companies sort of navigate this private to public transition. I can't imagine doing anything else. It's very intellectually rewarding. And, with a little bit of luck, we'll do something good for people and patients too. So.
And when I think of this challenge, and having spoken to quite a few biotech CFOs now, the skill set just seems to be, and I boil it down to sort of storytelling. They get excited about the science, like the people you described. They enjoy speaking to the scientists and the PhDs and helping translate the promise of what they're doing into the financial world. Have you ever thought about what you do in that terms? Like you're kind of like the connector of the PhDs on the wall and the MBAs over here, or do you look at it differently?
No, I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think, as I said earlier in our conversation, I'm trying to think about the business strategy in financial terms, right? I often say to people, you can tell me all you want about your strategy, but show me how you spend your money, and then I really know, right? And so, we got to take this idea that we have, and then it has to get translated into financial terms. And that says something about the spending that you have going forward. And then it says a lot about the capital raising that therefore you're going to need to do.
You got to do it in such a way that you're going to, spark the interest of the investor, not lose the excitement, whatever the PhDs are experiencing, and try to bring it over here.
I think that's right. Now, in fairness, I think most good biotech companies have scientific staff, CEOs, frankly, and CMOs, right. That are really good at that.
Yes.
Because at the end of the day, many of these investors want to hear it from the CEO or the CMO. And so many times I find when I'm not talking to the investor as much as I'm talking to the CEO, right? I'm trying to help him understand what that guy across the table probably wants to hear, you know? Um, and so if I can be helpful in crafting that story, if I can be helpful, that's, I think.
You mentioned sort of 5 transactions that had transpired, I guess, in this realm in biosciences. Each time there was a CEO who you sort of aligned yourself with, one would think.
Yeah.
Can you share with us, when did you know, and maybe you can use Coya as an example, why was it a good match for you when you began having that conversation with the CEO, understanding what the vision and the potential of the opportunity might be? Is that something you can share with us, or is it worth exploring?
Well, I mean, it's a very interesting thought. In each one of these cases, I'm coming in. I describe it at the private to public transition. So, I'm not coming in with $1 and I just took a license, right? So typically these guys have raised some money in advance. With Cellular Dynamics, the stem cell company is a little different. I was there. I was employee 13, but ordinarily a little bit later. And in each case, I was recruited by a CEO to help them navigate this process.
And this is, the CEO is looking for someone like you who've been involved in lots of deals and circumstances and know that, you're going to, it's not a straight path ever. And there are going to be disappointments and there are going to be some big wins. But am I right? Or, they're looking for someone who's done it.
I mean, I think it really helps that, in fact, I've been around a while and done this, right? And I think, and it does matter that I have a lot that I have this investor sort of point of view, right? It's the controllership job inside an early stage life science company, is it's not a complicated job, and many times the people that do that job haven't had the benefit of the sort of the capital markets experience that I have. That's not always the case, and there's extraordinary people to be found all over the place. But and so that's typically why they are looking for an outsider, right? Because all of a sudden, for the first time in the history of their company, sort of capital markets investment experience matters, a lot, and some understanding of this process. And typically, there's just compliance things that you have to be attentive to. So there's just once you have to get a financial statement prepared on time to meet SEC requirements, the standard, is pretty high. And so you got to be able to move the organization towards that to be state. And so I found it helpful that I have a pretty good idea what that to be state is like. And so then can move the finance organization there pretty quickly, because I don't need to spend a lot of time figuring it out. I kind of know where we got to be.
David, can I ask you about Coya now? We'll jump into Coya, and then you can share with us what the opportunity perhaps you saw was. But tell us about Coya Therapeutics. What is it about? What are its offerings?
Yeah. Well, Coya Therapeutics is built around what I think is a very powerful idea, and that is that the misregulation of regulatory T cells leads to inflammation and contributes to disease state. Okay, so let me unpack that. But the key word there is regulatory T cells. So what I think is increasingly well understood is that inflammation drives many chronic diseases. And in particular, in our company, we have come to believe that inflammation drives neurodegenerative diseases. So we are studying ALS, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, frontotemporal dementia. Similarly, lots of autoimmune disorders, rheumatoid arthritis, Crohn's colitis, also are driven by inflammation. Okay, well, so what drives inflammation? And Stanley Appel, who's a distinguished neurologist at Houston Methodist Hospital, discovered that there's this very important cell in the immune system called the regulatory T cell that's purpose is to tamp down inflammation. So when you have harm in the body, the immune system dials itself up and fights a little battle there, right? And when it's done, it needs to go back home. But instead, what's happening? That army's building now in the house and won't go away. And it's that chronic inflammation that drives these diseases. Well, what tells those cells to go back home is the regulatory T cell. And it turns out he discovered in ALS patients that he studied quite deeply that these regulatory T cells were being downregulated, were not functioning correctly. Now, why remains a question. But nonetheless, so the hypothesis then is if we could come up with a way of upregulating regulatory T cells, then we could find a way of controlling and tamping down inflammation. And if we could tamp down inflammation, then we might have a therapeutic strategy for these diseases that are driven by inflammation. And so we are all about finding ways to upregulate regulatory T cells and tamp down the inflammatory response of the immune system. And in so doing, we hope to have therapeutic effect in these neurodegenerative disorders. And I'm happy to say that we've shown very interesting, albeit early, data in patients showing that can be done in Alzheimer's and in ALS. And so we are now beginning a phase 2 clinical study of our drug Coya 302 in ALS. And our hope is that, we'll be able to significantly slow disease progression in ALS and make a difference for these patients. But, we think that same idea is going to work in other areas of neurodegeneration. And so next summer, Dr. Appel is doing a study in Alzheimer's using one of our using commercial quantities of what would be one of our drugs called Coya 301. In 12 patients, he showed last spring that we were able to stop disease progression in Alzheimer's, subject to all the limitations of that study. But now he's doing a big placebo-controlled study sponsored by the Gates Foundation. And, that data will read out next summer. And, we may have an opportunity in Alzheimer's. And if it works in ALS and it works in Alzheimer's, then we have, we wonder, might it work in Parkinson's? Might it work in FTD? And so now we have this opportunity to build our pipeline. But it's all around regulatory T cells. Tamp down inflammation and have an effect on disease progression.
Now, if I'm an investor, what's the novelty here? Because we've heard a lot about this sort of space of anti-inflammatory therapies and what have you. Is it the?
I think a number of people are trying to get after those drugs. I think what's unique is our insight into the power of regulatory T cells to do this.
Yep.
So there's people that are knocking around the edges of regulatory T cells. Oddly enough, in cancer therapeutics, the strategy has been just the opposite. In cancer therapeutics, the idea has been let's knock down the regulatory T cells so that we can keep the immune system firing and work on the cancer. We're oddly enough doing sort of the exact opposite. We're saying let's upregulate the T cells so that we can tamp down inflation. But I think the other insight that we've had, I think that's important, is that we believe that combination therapeutics are going to be very powerful. And so our drug Coya 302 is a combination of two drugs. I'll use that colloquially here for a second. One, if I could put a word on it, low dose IL-2, I can tell you what that means, but in any case, low dose IL-2 serves to upregulate the immune system. I beg your pardon, upregulate the T cells. And the other, CTLA-4, serves to downregulate certain cells of the immune system, macrophages and myeloid cells. And so there's sort of two insights there, right? But importantly, again, focused on the regulatory T cells, which sit at the center, we believe, of many of these pathways. So what other companies have done is they're downstream of the T cell working on some pathway of interest. But too often the immune system just doesn't end around. So we're hopeful that by focusing on the regulatory T cells, which seem to sit at the center of all this, we can have an effect where others haven't.
In the time frame you described, where you hope to have more results to share, is that pleasing to investors, or are investors?
No, it is. I mean, our company just last week, so this is all very timely, but last week we partnered our drug Coya 302 with Dr. Reddy's labs, and that provided upfront financing, $7.5 million of time zero financing. There's an additional $8.4 million of financing that we should get in the early part of next year if we're successful in getting an IND filed and dosing the first patient in a phase 2 trial. And so now all of a sudden, we closed a private placement, a PIPE financing, $26.5 million of gross proceeds. So the combination of the partnership proceeds and the financing proceeds, we think give us runway into 2026. And very importantly, that allows us, we think, to, if the stars align, complete the phase 2 trial of Coya 302 in ALS. And in the scheme of biotech, to think that you're going to have a result in a couple years out, that's really nice. And to know that you got the financing to get there in this biotech market, really nice. I mean, maybe your other guests have told you, in February, March of 2022, the XBI was 170. Today it's 80. I mean, this has been like the worst biotech market in like forever, right? And so
are you just it's hit bottom, so we can there's only one way to go, or what school of thought are you?
Well, mercifully, I don't have to make that call, right? I've got the money to get this trial done thanks to the confidence that investors have shown in our story and in our management
and that
team.
Reveals something given the current state of biotech.
I need to be careful what I say, but we are very proud, as you can understand, of what we've done. We think we've managed our company really well, and we're really excited for patients. At the end of the day, we want to make a difference, and Coya 302, we think, might make a difference for ALS patients. So we'll see. We got to run the trial.
Just about some of the pitfalls from your past experience in this sector, things to be avoided. And again, trials are expensive, and there's lots of pitfalls that can be you can encounter along the way. From your experience, what should we expect Coya to avoid? What will we see Coya not do? What will we see Coya do? Maybe, I don't know. When you look to invest that capital,
I don't want to be flippant when I say this, but I'm preparing a lecture for some students at Northwestern University next fall, and they want me to talk about biotech finance. The number one rule of biotech finance is don't blow up, right? You got to have the money. And I'm really excited that we've taken, and that sounds so self-evident, right? But I will tell you, I have been in conversations with founders that say, I don't want to take that dilution. I just want, my company's worth $200 million today, and my carry in it is 5%, and I just want $10 million, and it'll change my life. And the answer is there is no $200 million transaction. It is only 0 or $1 billion, right? And so you can't even think about that. You got to say, what does it take to get to $1 billion in market cap? And then I'll have what I have at the end. but you can't stop, right? There is no trade in the middle. And you have to raise the money to get to the end. You have to stay in the game. Um, you you'd asked me to think about books to read, and I don't know if this is the right time, but I encourage everybody to familiarize, to just Nassim Taleb's whole oeuvre. I mean, read Fooled by Randomness, read, Anti-Fragility. For a very specific treatment, there's a book out called Ergodicity, which is a fancy title, but it's a very small book and a very important concept. I mean, there's just when people say there's a 10% chance of that drug getting to the finish line, you think to yourself, well, if I get 10 drugs, one of them will work, right? And I'll be rich, or I will, right? But there's a very important premise underlying all those calculations, and that is that you can finance yourself to the finish line. And so all of modern corporate finance, Miller Modigliani and all this stuff that you learn in business school is all premised on the fact that the capital markets are perfect and allow you at some cost to get to the end. And in the real world, it's not that way. And so, as I say, it sounds trite, but it is very deep as you start unpacking it. I mean, you've got to stay alive till you figure out what's going to work.
Some of these companies are often just so early stage. When is it when you step in? When is it that you're kind of like, okay, now you can use a finance leader. Now what is it that what stage of maturity is that? Why is there a level of maturity? What is it that determines that for you?
So that's changed remarkably over these last 18 months, right? Because back in 2020, 2021, there were lots of deals that were being done off the back of preclinical data. And so they would bring they'd say, well, look, we're going to do a crossover round with, RA Capital and OrbiMed, just to name two big time institutional investors. And then we're going to go public in a JP Morgan led deal, and we're going to raise $200 million, right? And that was everybody's sort of fantasy. And that was for a period of time, kind of the model. And that model just completely broke. Now, nobody's doing that starting in about April of 2021. And so now I would tell you personally, what became clear to me was that while I'd been invited into a couple of those deals, I mean, Cellular Dynamics, which we talked about early on, was, we were starting this from scratch. I've come to believe that it's better when they have later stage assets, right? So I joined Coya knowing that they had, phase 2 assets, because I just think there's too much slip between the cup and the lip, with these preclinical and early phase 1s, and it's very hard to tell a story to investors. Investors are always worried about sort of the risk of infinite dilution, right? It's like, oh, we never get to the finish line, so we just get diluted, we get diluted. And that makes that story very, very difficult to tell. And so my personal sort of view is later stage assets and show me good investors. Show me a management team that's done it before. And I think that's much, better.
Much more ideal. Forgive me, we're running long. It's entirely my fault. I'll start jumping forward here. We like to ask for a finance strategic moment. This could have happened anytime in your career. What comes to mind when we ask for one?
Well, the thing that I thought about there was I joined a software company, 450 employees, public software company, and they were growing broke, but they were going broke really fast. And I'm somewhat bemused that they wanted gray-haired leadership, and at age 40, that qualifies you in a tech company, right? I was the old guy. And so we started thinking about the business and how we might measure its performance. And one of the things we hit upon doing is we started, where can we measure not financial output, right? Not outcome measures, but what sort of leading measures could we find? And And we hit upon the idea of time. Let's measure time. Let's measure how long things take. How long does it take to close, right? And if you drive time out of the closing process, interestingly enough, and perhaps not surprising to many, you drive up quality. Well, one of the things we did was we were building websites. We were measuring how long it took, and it took 30 days, right? Well, it turned out 15 of those days were spent in the finance department doing credit checks on the customer. 15 days to call up a D&B, but now we had a thing that we could work on. Well, how do you take 15 days out of credit checking? And it turned out that the finance team is on the 4th floor and the production team is on the 1st floor. And, these are these kinds of things that happen that are just sort of mind numbing. And so it just going back and forth to answer questions became really hard. And so they would send an envelope down and, it would come back up. In any case, our idea was why don't we take the credit people and put them on the 1st floor? And we did. And, 15 days went to, a couple hours, and, we're off to the races. And so it was just an example of where, collecting data in a sort of a novel way made this enormous, gave you then insight into how you can dramatically change the customer service proposition for this particular company. And so there's my example. There's others, but that was, and we certainly applied those concepts to the finance too. I mean, I was sort of talking about my second CFO job. It took him 30 days to close the books, and new idea. We're going to close in 3.
CFOs and controllers, does expense management feel like a necessary evil? It's time to switch to Brex. Brex automates and accelerates spend management with easy-to-use corporate cards, travel, expense management, and bill pay, all on one AI-powered platform. Brex makes it easy to boost efficiency and compliance enterprise-wide and free up your managers, employees, and accounting team for higher impact work. Top companies from startups to enterprises are using Brex to automate manual work and transform their finance operations. We're talking DoorDash, Robinhood, Airtable, and countless other industry leaders. Ready to join them? Switch to AI-powered spend management at Brex.com. Let's jump to the mentoring round. And I want you to think back to the first time you stepped into a CFO role, preferably in biotech, I think, just because you're such a seasoned veteran there. I'm just curious, if you think back to the first 30 days, what was it that you wish someone had told you? There was something you were very familiar with all aspects, but I wish someone told me this. Anything?
Well, I want to go back, if you'll permit me, I want to go back to this very early conversation, because I was this sort of deal guy, right? And I think of everything as being sort of episodic, and we get all excited and we do some analysis, or we do it, right? And so I showed up my very first CFO job with all kinds of ideas as a young guy. It's like I had all these ideas. Okay, fine. What I didn't understand was that that public reporting function is on a calendar. They are a machine, and you imperil that machine at great risk. And so, and there's a calendar, right? There's a closing calendar. And on this day we do this, and on this day we do this, and on this day we do this. And you mess with that at your grave peril. And I didn't understand that at all. And I think, and I'm embarrassed in hindsight then to impute on those team members a lack of interest in improving the business, and, just being like not getting it and all this stuff. When in fact, the guy that didn't get it was me, right? And they were very enthusiastic about all these ideas, but you had to do them in the last 2 weeks of the month, not the first 2 weeks of the month. And you had to do them in August after we filed the 10Q, not in the middle of the annual meetings planning cycle, you know? So that was my lesson for people coming outside that. Understand, there's a process here. There's a machine, there's a calendar, and it's enormously important because the consequences in a public company of failing to file timely are really, really high. So you have very able, very conscientious people that are trying to do exactly the right thing, and they didn't need all my drama there in those early days. And I hopefully with a few years of experience, I understand now how that works.
David, we always like to ask our guests to reflect a little on the personal side for us, and we always put you on the spot with this question. In general, what does most people not know about you? Something.
Well, I've been sitting here looking at this cluttered background, and so I'll just direct your attention to two things. That's all piano scores up there in the corner. I'm an avid piano player and have been a piano player most of my life. And then down there on the floor, you'll see a bunch of kettlebells. I'm actually a certified strength and conditioning coach. I'm happy to say along the way, coached a young man who became a pitcher in the Pittsburgh Pirates minor league organization.
Wow. Well, we'll have to do part 2 of an episode with you, David, I think. You did mention some books for us earlier. Were those all you care to share? Or
Well, I think those are two really important ones. I think understanding probability, understanding the distribution of outcomes is very critical to finance. So I really do encourage everyone to be aware of Nassim Taleb, Anti-Fragile, Fooled by Randomness, The Black Swan. Biotech is marked by these long tail events, right? It could be super successful. It could be a disaster. We don't play in the middle of the distribution very much. And then I mentioned the other book, Ergodicity. And he just draws a distinction between what I characterize as, I'm happy to tell you, ensemble risk versus time risk. And it's to this idea of blow-ups, right? Think about playing Russian roulette, right? You have I have a 5-6 chance of success, right? Well, ask yourself, what happens if you play that game over time versus if a population plays that game over time? Well, if the population plays that game over time, the probability stays 5/6, 5/6, 5/6. But if you play Russian roulette over time, the outcome ends up being 0. And so certain games have blow-up risk. Biotech's one of them, right? And so you got to understand, am I investing in government bonds or am I investing in biotech? And your assessment of risk and tail risk in particular changes dramatically. And so how do you protect yourself against that tail risk? Well, that goes to this whole conversation we had about how you finance yourself. So anyway, if you want a theoretical construct around some of these qualitative ideas, those would be.
If a friend is aware you play the piano and you're at a social event and they have a piano and he asks you or she asks you to, please, David, will you play this for us, or what you played before? Is that a scenario that could happen, or are you more of an individual piano player where you like to play alone and it's somewhat therapeutic for you? I don't know. Maybe it's both. But are you of one world or the other?
Well, I'm more to the latter. I'm playing fairly difficult classical music relatively poorly. Right? So
does this go back to your college years, by the way? I mean, is it something that's followed, or did you pick it up somewhere?
My dad's a church musician. I played the piano, as a very young boy. I played the violin all through college. So, I sing in choirs. That's a little bit of my thing. Right. But I'm not the kind of guy that can plink out pop hits to entertain a group. I do have a very extensive Christmas sing-along literature, and so we do have a party at our house, and we all
nice. Thank you for indulging me there. We are up to our final question, where I'm going to ask you to look forward finally, and we're interested in what your priorities are as CFO Coya Therapeutics for the coming 12 months. What is it that you're focused on?
Yeah, I think we have dramatically transformed our company in the past week, right? The partnership has with Dr. Reddy's had important value both financially and strategically. The financing that we just did, added on to that, and so we want to make sure that story gets well told over the next 12 months. And I think we're going to be very, very clearly focused on telling that story. Our organization is very focused on successfully executing the clinical trial of Coya 302. And I leave that in the able hands of my colleague, Fred Grossman, our CMO. But I look forward to helping as I can in managing that process. Qualitatively or strategically, I should say, the Dr. Reddy's partnership also persuaded us that the opportunity to partner Coya 302 in other indications is an idea that has lots of merit. And so my colleague Arun Swaminathan, who brought that and put that Reddy's deal together, he's hard at work thinking about other partnerships that we might put together. So we want to tell I think, as I say, we've transformed the company. We want to tell that story, point one. Point two, we want to execute on delivering our promise to ourselves, our investors, and our patients about what Coya 302 might deliver in ALS. And then we want to see what else how we can build the company through acquisition. I think that's where we're focused.
David Snyder, thank you for joining us on CFO Thought Leader.
Jack, thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun.
Hello, Thought Leader listeners. We hope 2024 is treating you well. If you haven't already, we hope you'll pay a visit to CFOthoughtleader.com and go ahead and subscribe to our Mentoring Round newsletter, where we highlight the career lessons and moments of strategic insight shared by our recent CFO guests. Also, LinkedIn users, please go ahead and follow our CFO Thought Leader company page, and you'll be certain not to miss a single Thought Leader video debut. CFO Thought Leader, the #1 thought leadership platform exclusively for and by CFOs. As always, thank you for listening.